All right. Good morning, everyone. Hello. Welcome to Getting Your Garden Started webinar. My name is Delana Arnold, and I'm the Education's Programs Manager for the Georgian Bay Biosphere, so Miigwech, and thank you very much for joining us today. There's still a few people trickling in, so as they do so, I'd like to share a little bit about the Georgian Bay Biosphere. We are one of 18 UNESCO World Biospheres in Canada, and our region is ecologically unique. We have the largest freshwater archipelago on Earth. The biosphere stretches about 200 kilometers from the Severn River in the south to the French River in the north, and it was designated a biosphere in 2004. We are a registered charity with an administrative office in Parry Sound, and we rely on grants, partnerships, and donations to do our conservation and education work. So sustainable food systems are a really important part of being a UNESCO biosphere. Since 2008, our organization has led and partnered on food programs with schools, food producers, local government, First Nations, and other not-for-profits in the area. This has included over 50 hands-on food skill building workshops and events. We've helped with the 7 community gardens that are currently in Parry Sound. And we were able to offer 4 years of community kitchens, which was offered twice weekly for seniors and elders. And Glenda was the one who was able to lead that. We also have the Grown by the Bay local food guide, which is online, and there is a printed brochure, and it lists regional producers, their availability, as well as a number of other useful local food resources. And we have many other resources, all things food and garden, on our website. So we're going to jump right in. We are recording today's session. It will be uploaded to our YouTube channel later today, and we will be sharing that link with everybody. So if you missed something, don't worry, it will be recorded. There is a Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. So I invite you to just wiggle your mouse and see if you can see a little button that says Q&A. If you have a question at any time in the webinar, we ask that you put it in there, not in the chat, in the Q&A. We're going to answer questions about midway through the presentation, and then again at the end, we'll go over lots of questions then. So it looks like most people have now joined us, so we'd like to acknowledge the land before we begin. We respect and recognize the inherent rights and governance of the Anishinaabe Pre-Confederation. We acknowledge the rights of the Anishinaabe as legally recognized in the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850 and the Williams Treaty of 1923. Indigenous peoples in the area are of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi lineage. Mohawk people from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy also reside in the area and have historical connections to both southern and eastern Ontario. This region is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. So before I turn things over to Glenda for today, we have a few questions for everyone who's joined us, just to help get a sense of where everyone is at in their gardening. So I'm going to launch a poll. And everyone should be able to see a question now, and we'll leave it up for about 10 seconds. How many years have you grown a fruit and vegetable garden, or just some fruit and veggie plants? Maybe last year was your first year, maybe you've never done it ever once in your life, or maybe you have over a decade of experience. All right, and I'll wait maybe 4 more seconds. Okay. So just so everyone can see, most of the people here today have gardened either never or just last year was their first year. Although it is interesting to see it's fairly across the board. So we have 2 more questions. Our next question, what does your current fruit and vegetable garden look like? And you can select all that apply. Maybe you have a combination of a few potted plants and a raised bed garden. Maybe you don't have a garden. Maybe there's something that wasn't listed here. Other gardens can take on many shapes, sizes, and forms. Maybe you have a community garden plot in Parry Sound or one of the many, many others across the province. Awesome. Now again, I'll give it about 4 more seconds. All right, and I'm going to stop that and I'm going to share it with everybody. Again, a pretty diverse set of answers, actually. So we have a few others, a few things that weren't captured in the list, a couple community garden plots, but the majority of people, almost half of people, have a small raised bed or in-ground garden that's about 10 square feet or less. All right, so our last question for today, or for the start. What has been your biggest garden challenge? And again, you can select more than one here. I don't know where to start when it comes to growing plants, maybe for some of you who've never done it before. I have trouble starting seeds successfully and/or transplanting them into the garden. I don't have enough space. It's always my problem, no matter how big my garden is. I can't find time for maintenance. I hear that one often. My garden sees a lot of pests and diseases, or my plants are generally in poor condition and you don't get a lot of harvest from them. Maybe it's all of the above. And there's a lot more reading on this one, so I'll give it about 6 more seconds if you want to enter a couple of answers. Someone just put in the chat that their big problem is squirrels. We can put that under the pest category. That's another one I hear a lot. All right, so I'm going to end this and I'm going to share these results. So one of the biggest challenges is starting seeds successfully and/or transplanting them. That's excellent. We'll be talking about that a lot today. Chipmunks, yeah. And plants being in generally poor condition and not a lot of harvest from them. This is really good to know. Time for maintenance. I'm glad to see that one is actually, it's a real issue for some people, but it's not the biggest thing that's brought us here today. So these questions are really, really helpful for us. Before I just turn it over to Glenda now, the Biosphere has a resource guide on our website that's called Seed to Soil, a gardening guide. And because there's going to be a lot of information in today's webinar, but also sent out as the follow-up email, I just wanted to share a small little paragraph that's in that guide because I think it's really relevant and it's something I still tell myself all the time and it does really help me. So it says, new gardens, no matter what type, are not like new electronics or cars, where you can expect things to run smoothly and simply because they're new. With proper care, your garden will get better with age. Don't compare the results of your first year to your grandmother's well-established garden. The important thing is just to start. I really love that, and I think that's why everyone's here today, is because they just want to get started. So without further ado, I will now turn things over to Glenda Clayton. Glenda is the Inclusion and Support Facilitator with Community Living Parry Sound. She's the coordinator for the Parry Sound Community Gardens, and she's also a previous Biosphere staff member. Glenda, there is a big gray box over the presentation. I think you just have to close a few things.
And I'm assuming you're good now?
That's much better.
Excellent. Closing the poll and stuff. Thank you, Delana, and good morning, folks. Depending where you are in the province, some of your Northern Ontario folks might be, I don't know what weather you're looking at. We had that lovely bit of spring and now it's kind of gone back into remission, but that's kind of, you know, it gives you lots of time to think about how you're going to be starting the garden. And I love those polls because I like what I saw. And so I just a little bit to share then. How long have I been gardening? I want to say, I don't know. My mom probably put me into the garden when I was 2 or 3. I don't know how helpful I was then, but it's certainly, that's what sparked my interest and the ability to grow food and that going out and harvesting at the end of a workday and pulling in what you're going to have for dinner. I just love that feeling. In terms of how I garden, I'll just share too, because that was one of the poll questions. Raised, in-ground, containers, community garden. So all of those are part of my growing, and I value that a lot. My biggest nemesis, deer. I love fences. They help keep the deer out. And of course, I could always use more space for gardening. I really like, if there's one thing to really like from COVID, if that sounds strange, I'm sorry, but is what all of a sudden people really got interested in things like growing food, baking, preserving, Record numbers of mason jars went out last fall, record numbers of seed orders, seed companies doubling, tripling their business. It's fantastic to know that and to see that interest. So obviously, before we talk about how to start your garden, it's the why. Why will you be gardening? And again, it might be because you want to have that choice of the food that you're eating, to know that you're growing probably, hopefully, organic food and having that for your family. It's a fantastic opportunity to exercise. And again, most of us are going to be sticking close to home for a while. So why not, right? Be gardening, of course. And if you do have children, it's a fantastic opportunity to get them out, learning about nurturing something, the plants, learning about eating a variety of foods, but also just basic plant biology. So there's fabulous opportunities in gardening. So we'll get into now how to start your garden. If the slide wants to move. Okay. There we go. So, of course, like many things in our lives, it kind of starts with a plan. And I like to start thinking, you think at the beginning, like, ideally, what do you want to grow? So maybe you have a vision of harvesting bushels of corn, like we did when we were kids, or, big fat watermelons and such. Suspect if you're the person, there was someone from Cornwall, that could be part of your list. But if you're the person in Northern Ontario, some of that may be a bit more challenging. So really create your list first of ideally what your family would like to grow, and then start with that little bit, as we often have to, with a bit of reality check. Look at your climate, so your growth zone. So, we're 4B. So look at what types of things will grow well. I know for past experience, for me, that's everything: tomatoes, peas, asparagus, garlic, beans, cucumbers, pumpkins, kale, broccoli. A really good variety of produce can be grown in this area. Do I bother with corn? No, because it takes up a lot of room and it might be challenging for me to harvest the corn just because of our growing season. So you pare down your list based on the reality of the climate zone that you're in, the growing zone. Then, of course, it's where are you going to be growing? What kind of space do you have? Are you going to do a classic in-ground garden? And I know certainly for me, first time when I moved into our house here, I moved from the Kingston area. So I used to have some good soil and warmer weather, and then moved to the Parry Sound area. And when I moved in, it's like, oh, I have a whole yard of sand. So I had to work, I worked right away at getting that sawed off to get some space and to get a garden started. So again, kind of what Delana was saying, my first garden, it was pretty hopeless. But I got it in and got something, and it expanded each year. And 20 years later, it's now a reasonable garden. But of course, and I saw that, what was it? 45% of you already use a raised bed. Excellent. Again, fabulous option. We'll take a look at each of those too in terms of pluses and minuses. Containers, easy peasy, suits balconies. There's all sorts of, ways to utilize containers. Or as I said, it may be all three. But again, what you're going to be growing will depend on what method you're choosing. So for instance, you're probably not going to grow corn in containers, just saying. You're probably going to do that if you have good ground space for that. So let's say you're one of those people and you're decided, I've got great space to do an in-ground garden, and that's going to be my preferred method. And this is true for all the raised or containers. First and foremost, you need sun. You want about at least 8 hours of sun a day. And when you're planning this, as if this is your first garden, because a few of you ran into that or in that category, think also like, sure, it's one thing to stand out there on your lawn in April before the trees have leafed out and say, fantastic, look at the sun. And then that big maple or oak puts its leaves on in middle of May, and then you're going, oh, too shaded. And most of our vegetables, herbs, everything generally need that at least 8 hours of sun. Sheltered. So you picked a spot for your garden and it's between two buildings, and you've created a wind tunnel. So your plants will suffer because of always being buffeted by wind. The soil, you get what you get in case of our in-ground. Of course, we can add soil amendments, and that helps. That takes time. Just the range of people in the province, Some of you may be actually blessed with the soil, super lottery of having a sandy loam soil, which you have across, you can grow great variety of things. I just talking from a local perspective, if you're someone like me, you have the great sand flats of Nobel. So I have basically the equivalent of a beach garden. A little further inland, you might have a clay soil. So that type of soil that if you were to ball it up in your hand and squeeze it when it's a little bit damp, it's going to stay in a ball. It's, like pottery clay. And each of this, there's some advantages and disadvantages, but generally it's nice to have that mix of a sandy loam soil. Things that you can do to improve clay soils, you can add a wee bit of sand to help create more airspace, and of course, compost, compost, compost. Clay soils have an advantage because they actually hold nutrients quite well, so your plants will be well fed over their lifetime, but clay soils have trouble with drainage and will often be quite cool and wet for a long time in the spring. The other side of that, the sandy soils, again, they dry out in the spring nicely. It doesn't take them long to dry out, but they don't hold nutrients well. So again, compost, 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 maybe blood meal, things like that, bone meal, but leaf compost, manure, things like that. Back to the in-ground garden slope. If you have a slope, it can lead to erosion issues depending on how steep the slope is. But of course, terracing is an option. And I know just from personal experience, Delena's garden would be a wonderful example of a garden that's been terraced in her backyard to help create sort of large steps that she can grow on her slope. Obviously, you need a water source. Water source could be rain barrels close by that are collecting rain off your roof. It could be barrels that you fill from a hose. We'll talk about how to water wisely a little bit later, but definitely you want water close by, or else your exercise program is going to get a lot more intense if you have to carry water for any distance. So I look at the pluses of an in-ground garden as being relatively easy to start. As I said, when I moved into my house, it was June 8th, 21 years ago. It's pretty easy to go strip off some sod, turn up the soil, add a little amendments, and start. Fence is lovely, again, to keep some of the critters out. The disadvantages a little bit to some of the in-ground stuff, weed competition from the edges can be a bit of an issue. If your exercise program, a lot of bending and stuff, that's the good and the bad. But, again, in-ground might take a little bit longer in the spring to warm up because it's, directly in ground to dry up and warm up. But again, excellent option. That's what many of us do have in-ground gardens. So raised beds, lovely too. This happens to be a tour I had long pre-COVID out west. This is Jasper's community garden and a lovely collection of colorful raised beds and all sorts of fun planter styles. So advantage of raised beds. You get a longer growing season because the beds will warm up in the spring quite quickly because they're above the ground, and into the fall, they're so super easy to protect with a bit of a row cloth over top, or you can make a simple pyramid thing or plastic with plastic and board, anything to help protect them in the fall, gets a nice long growing season. Good drainage. Obviously, as the raised bed, the moisture can run through, and that helps, especially in the spring. You can concentrate your soil amendments so easily in a raised bed. You add those bags of manure or bags of compost perfectly contained within the structure. Less weeding because you're having less competition from the edges, the sides, and accessible because that raised bed makes it easier for some people that might have issues with bending and things. And depending on the height, you can make them totally accessible. I've seen raised beds with even benches along the side so someone could sit and attend to their garden for harvest and weeding. So my recommendation, if you're looking at raised beds, lots of good patterns online. I like a minimum, I would like 4 feet by 8 feet. Lumber comes and makes it easy. 4 feet, I can reach across to the middle from either side, makes a decent sized bed. Recently at one of our community gardens, we made 4 by 8 by 2 feet high raised beds in order to improve accessibility for folks that, again, bending can become an issue. And I'd say one of the disadvantages for raised beds right now, well, if you're building from lumber, if you've looked at the price of lumber lately, you may be in for some I don't know, it's sticker shock for sure. Cedar beds will be quite expensive. I've seen some interesting things with even just some wood, part corrugated steel. I've seen cement blocks, brick blocks used. There's all sorts of options. And I've even seen like straw bales. You can make sort of contain a temporary raised bed with straw bales. There are lots of options, but of course, a cedar raised bed is going to last you for a long time. But unfortunately, right now, it's going to cost you a wee bit too. Whoops, wrong way. Containers. Yeah, easy, very portable, very versatile. The Biosphere ran a lovely program last year where lots of large containers went out to the community for people to grow vegetables in on their balcony, their decks, backyards. A large container, you can put a nice variety between tomato, lettuce, and create yourself a little salad container. Again, accessibility, a large container, less bending over perhaps. Containers can be put up on raised tables, structures, all those make them a nice choice for accessibility. Fantastic drainage. Oh yeah, and back to, sorry, this is me jumping around, back to the raised beds and in terms of containers. A disadvantage, they also dry out quite quickly. So you have to be there to water. If you have containers, you can't really go away for a week unless you've set up some sort of slow drip system for them. And same with raised beds. A slight disadvantage is they do dry out more quickly. But containers like raised beds, easy to protect. Bad weather coming, depending on the size of the container, slip it under a protective, eaves, or slip it to beside a wall. Tarp it with some plastic or some filter cloth or things like that. So that's why I lean to all three methods really for growing. I like my in-ground space. It's easy, cheaper, gives me lots of space. I like my raised bed for certain things, certain crops. A lot of my herbs could be in the raised bed. I don't have to worry about the deer them as much. Containers, also like them because again, the ability to move them around and chase the sun if I need, bring them inside into the screen porch for a bit of time for bad weather and things like that. One of the disadvantages can be for containers, like again, you could salvage 5-gallon pails. They've worked beautifully for tomato plants and stuff, but it can be the cost if you want beautiful looking pots, but they're going to last you a long time. The other thing is, I mean, I fill my garage with a lot of large containers, and so they take up quite a bit of space for storage. Of course, you're going to have to amend the soil most years in your container because the nutrients are going to be used up throughout your growing season. One good source, if you have a link to any people who do large tree planting stuff in like subdivisions and stuff, I've gained a number of super large pots, fantastic, after trees have been planted in a community. So seeds or started plants. So you're at perfect time for starting many different seeds now to get into the garden this year. So why choose the seed option? First off, it's cheaper. A package of $4 seeds, you might have 40 to 50 plants from that package, so that's wonderful. You have a great deal of choice. If you want a fun thing, look through some of the seed catalogs or online, whatever. And, tomato plants, I've got some boxcar willies started, mortgage lifters, all sorts of fun names. So you have a choice from some heirlooms, some old species. You could look at hybrid species, read the details, check out the exact growing conditions that that plant needs. There's a lot of information, so you could make great choices of seeds for your garden. A slight negative might be, do you have the time? I saw some people were concerned about maintenance, and this would be the start of the maintenance really is, do you have time to take care of those seedlings? I mean, it's not hard, but you have to be attentive to the moisture requirements, and that would be key. So you have to be around. But again, most of us are going to be around for a little bit around home, so it might be a good year to try seed starting if you haven't already. So why buy started plants? Well, it's convenient. You want 4 tomato plants, you can go buy 4 tomato plants. I have about 40 started at home right now. And when you're buying those plants, you can instantly judge the health. So you know what you're buying. You can look at the plant, great plant, healthy. So you've got something ready to go into the ground. The negative would be then, of course, the cost. For those 4 tomato plants, you might spend $2, $3. The package of seed, you'd have had 30 to 40. And you also generally have less choice unless you have a very wonderful greenhouse near you that has large varieties. And we tend to find that, you might have 4 or 5 tomato plants to choose from as opposed to the 30 or 40 if you were choosing your own seeds. So in a moment, we're going to look at, I decided to break up a PowerPoint with doing a little video of myself starting seeds on the weekend. But we thought it might be a nice opportunity to take a break right now to answer some questions. So I'm going to hit stop share and we'll go to some questions.
Awesome, Glenda. So we do have a couple coming in. Nicole has asked, how do we manage deer, chipmunks, and squirrels? And I know you and I each have some strategies, so I'll let you go first.
Right. I love my fence. I would not ever go back to not having a fenced garden. And I actually chose, and this will, my answer will get a little complicated. I did not want to go to any wire fence that was so small of a square that would potentially trap something called the eastern fox snake, because we have them in our neck of the woods. It's a threatened species. And if the square is too small, the snake might, in climbing the fence, get caught and be killed. So I knew I wanted a fence that had an opening of at least 2 by 3 inches size. I was able to source 8-foot fence, deer fence. I think, well, my company was in Manotick. It's easy. It's plastic fence. I can attest to it's lasted me now 10 to 12 years, I'm thinking, and it's still in good shape, easy to install. I put in the poles and use zip ties to attach it to the poles. Super easy. In our community gardens, we've used, it's called corn cribbing fence, and that's about 5 feet high. Extend the fence poles and then run fishing line wire at something at the 7-foot level, because you want to ensure the deer stay out of your garden. And I got to say, deer are amazing in their ability to jump. I put pumpkins in my garden last year after jack-o'-lanterns, stick them in the garden. And darned if the deer didn't jump over that 8-foot fence to get to the pumpkins, but they weren't in the garden for the rest of the year. But pumpkins apparently were the candy at November for them to be in there. Chipmunks, oh, get a fox snake if you could. Like that's why I cheer the fox snakes in my neighborhood, because they do eat chipmunks, and that's wonderful. There's a few other predators. Yeah, chipmunks. Maybe Delana has a good idea on those. I mean, I don't, you hear things like cayenne pepper and stuff like that. I'm not going there. What was my other pest? You said deer, chipmunk, and sorry, squirrels. Yeah. Again, challenging, very challenging, so agile. So just noise, discouragement when they're there, but that's about it. I mean, sometimes a dog can keep some of those critters a little bit at bay, but it's all part of the fun, I guess, of gardening. And I guess we have to accept that some of it, what we grow, is also to be shared with the species that we share this space with. But I still hate when they steal my blueberries.
I've heard of some people having sacrifice plants too, which isn't something I try, but they have some tasty species that are really easy for the chipmunks in the hope that they leave others alone. And Glenda, you also have a rubber snake in your garden that has startled.
Yeah, it startles people. It doesn't seem to startle the darn chipmunks. So yeah, and again, you probably have seen people have done things like old CDs or DVDs to keep birds out of their raspberries. That works. Some fine net coverings. I've used that to cover blueberry plants. So that's probably tried it. If there's a safe barrier that you can use, I've used just old window screening too, tied over plants to help protect them. My mom swears by, she uses dryer sheets, bounce sheets tied to various things. And apparently deer don't like the smell of those. I don't like the smell of them either though. So I tend to not use them.
I will say last year I used my mom's strategy, which was a bar of Irish Spring soap, and I put it in an onion bag and I hung it in front of my hollyhocks, and I would say that it worked well. We have a bunch of other questions too, so I'm thinking maybe we'll do 2 or 3 more before we watch the video. Susan's asked, what type of vegetables do you plant in your containers?
Okay.
And I'll let you speak to that.
Okay.
As well.
Because my garden soil seems to suffer, my plants, if I put tomatoes in my garden, I almost always end up with late season blight. Despite doing all my best for removing, we'll talk again, diseased foliage, I try to make sure I have good ventilation, but it seems to be, it's in the soil. So I almost always have all my tomato plants outside of my garden in large containers. And when I'm saying large, oh, yeah, a meter across type containers, and then I'll put a few basil plants and things like that at the base. Tomatillos I grew in big containers last year. I will do containers of just herbs, so basil, rosemary, sage, things like that. Not so much lettuce for me because that grows quite well in the garden, but I've seen people do successfully cucumbers. You can buy special bush type smaller cucumber plants that don't roam quite as much. So if you're going to grow in containers, you can check the seed catalogs or seeds descriptions, check your greenhouse to see what kind of plants are actually made for containers too. There's a lot of good dwarf varieties. Cherry tomatoes do super well in containers.
Yeah, we had a variety last year of tomato that's called Tiny Tim. It's pretty common and it only really grows about a foot, no more than a foot and a half. They're excellent for containers. We've done eggplant and peppers in containers as well. And a bunch of herbs like chamomile seem to like the container. Last year, I tried something new too, where I took some plastic containers and cut the bottoms off. And then I put squash in them so that they'd have more root space. And that also worked pretty well. The squash were pretty happy. Um, so Sandra's asked, what is a good natural fertilizer to feed your seeds and when would you apply it?
Excellent question. So I quite like sticking with things like you can buy kelp powder that you can then mix and use it while you're watering. But before I get going any too far, probably really think about what your soil is like and what it needs, right? Because sure, there's general fertilizers and such, but try to what type of soil you have, and there are opportunities to do soil analysis still, and that can help fine tune what you need. But generally, things that would be good for natural fertilizers: making compost tea, making a grass clipping tea, uh, bone meal applied in the fall to help let it work its way in. Wood ashes can be used sparingly. I prefer to mix wood ashes in with the compost. Manure teas that then can also be used to water. And when I'm talking about manure, make sure it's composted, not fresh manure, of course. And but I'm a fan of things that like the kelp powder. Fish emulsion is another good option. But really, the best advice is try to figure out what your soil might need and then target it based on that. And sometimes your plants can tell you what it needs. Curling leaves might be an indication of lack of potassium, or maybe it's phosphorus. You get some purple in your leaves and things like that. So nitrogen might be another one that you could naturally get through how you choose to plant. You could put beans in. Bush beans can help feed your soil with nitrogen. Coffee grounds, lovely. Yeah, eggshells, lovely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you're one of the people, you're not the Cornwall person, you've got limestone base, but if you're up here, you've got granitic based soils, and our soils tend to be more on the acid side and such. So definitely we're always looking to neutralize, and we tend to be poor in things like calcium. So eggshells are fantastic for that.
So there's a number of questions about seeds, and I think some of them might be answered in the video.
Okay.
So
Yep.
while you pull the video up, Glenda, I'm just going to read a comment. Tammy said that squirrels like fresh dirt, mulch, etc. So when that is the case, Tammy puts gravel or rocks around the plants so that the squirrels don't disturb the roots. It helps a lot, but not 100%. So there's another little strategy.
Yep. And I've known some people put some chicken wire over things so the squirrels can't dig them up. Again, for me, I'm cautious about squirrels and fox snakes and chicken wire. All right. So hit this, and hopefully this is again just to give you a little idea about seed starting, and then we'll be back to a PowerPoint. It's so lovely to have this warm weather in April, to be out on my porch doing this seeding rather than the kitchen counter making a mess. I'll just throw that caution out there. It's really easy to get super excited when we get this incredible warm weather in April, but realize we have to really kind of pay attention to when our frost dates are and do our planting based on the charts that are available, like on the Biosphere website, about how many weeks before our frost date. Typically in this area, in our zone of 4B, we're frost date about May 24, that weekend. So what kind of things have I already started? I've already started my tomatoes. So they get started about 8 weeks ahead of the last frost date. So they've started back early April is when I start those. But now I want to start a bit of broccoli to get them head started. And I'm just going to point out my very spindly seedlings here. Those are actually broccoli seedlings that are planted last weekend. I staged them because I don't necessarily want my broccoli harvest to come on all at once. So if I have 4 plants going in the garden a couple weeks ahead of the others that I'm going to plant today, then that helps stage. I've also, just because for fun, I started some Swiss chard so that can go in the garden early. So we talked about the advantages of doing your own seeds versus buying ready started plants. Doing your own seeds is quite easy. You do want to buy some sterile soil seed starting mix, okay? So just don't go dig soil from the garden, because your little seeds might have a hard time with the fungus that are in the soil, and they may succumb to that. So a sterile mix is easy to find. You can go to your, not under lockdown, but you could go to your hardware store perhaps, order for curbside pickup. Some of the nurseries, Little Garden is a good one in town. I put this into my bin because I found that easier way to do it. Pour in enough water to bring it up to a type of, basically moist, damp sponge. That's what I'm aiming for. Mix it in so it's consistent throughout the soil. It's always fun to play in dirt. Back to your childhood. And this is when, you can see from my example on the table, maybe your neighbor's recycling bin, maybe your own, but there's lots of materials to start plants in out there already. These make fantastic little greenhouses. You can reverse the lids on top to make a perfect greenhouse and keep the moisture in. So as I mentioned, I've already started my tomatoes. That's good. Next stage is my broccolis. I might start some lettuce today, some basil, and have those ready for the garden. I'm going to wait a full couple weeks before I start my cucumber, squash, and that family. They grow very quickly, and you don't want to have the monsters taking over your house. Yeah. So, and they don't actually like to be transplanted. More on that later. Basically, pack in the soil just lightly, but do, and I'm using cells here, do work the thumbs down to make sure that you have no air pockets. Okay, so it's nice, lightly moistured. And seed planting general rule is very small seeds, barely just under the surface. Sometimes we say about the size of the seed is the step that you should plant them. So as you know, your tomato seeds and things like that are quite small. When it comes to squash, pumpkin, they're quite large. So you'll want to go further down. So something to make a little divot, could be just your finger, top of the pan, pencil eraser, popsicle stick, you name it. And yeah, here is my broccoli seed. So you can see it says right on the package, everything you need to know, which is wonderful. Direct seed outdoors as soon as chance of hard frost is passed, or start indoors 4 to 6 weeks before the planting out date. Sow at 0.5 centimeters deep. Guess what? We can do that. So it's almost impossible to get just the right amount of seeds out, but we'll show you what you do with those in a moment. Oh, see, there's already 2 in there. That's all right. One may make it, one may not. There we go. I'm just going to brush that lightly on top. And into a pot like this, my salvaged plastic. Look at that lovely lid to make an instant greenhouse. The thing about this, it also helps keep the moisture in, which you want at the first. You want to have a very consistent, even moisture. Too much water, you're probably going to find a little layer of mold perhaps growing on your soil surface. And the other thing you want to do is label, because honestly, once things come up, you'll think you know what you've planted, but you may forget. And so it's nice to label. Popsicle sticks work well. These plastic cartons, you can write on them. I've used masking tape before. And you may even want to make a note of the date that you planted, again, just to keep your records to see how things have started. So this now I would like to take to a nice little warm spot to help the soil warm up and let the seeds germinate. So that for me often has been above my wood stove on the mantle, and that's a good spot, or on the tiles in front of it. Some people use water heaters, top of fridge. Find that nice little warm spot to have that consistent heat. And as soon as the seedlings come up, move them into the light. They really need a lot of light, so a south-facing window is ideal. Grow lights are ideal. This week has been incredible for April, so most of my plants have actually been out in the screen porch, so they're already getting a little bit of real natural light, which is also key. So you've done a fantastic job, and you've got seedlings galore all ready to go. So here my tomatoes started approximately not even quite 2 weeks ago. But you can see I have 2 in some cells and 3 in another. This is where we do the slightly brutal. Too much competition in the cell, you're just going to end up with weaker plants. You could try to tease them apart and repot them. That's possibly going to work. Sometimes you just disturb the roots and you end up destroying both. I just do the chop off their heads method. I like my nail scissors for that. It's probably the best use for nail scissors for me. And there goes one. So I have 1 plant left in that cell. Obviously, you choose the best plant to leave standing. There we go. Now I have 4 standing tomato plants there ready. These guys are still too young to give a little boost of fertilizer, but perhaps in their next with full leaf state, I'll give them a light half-strength natural fertilizer drink every other week just to help encourage their growth. They'll be ready for planting, as I say, middle of May, perhaps in a container, perhaps directly in the ground. So other things, also, as I say, might start some lettuce today, basil. That's all stuff that can be pre-started in the house, ready to move out into the garden. So that's seeding in a nutshell. Just a little thing to talk about too is garden planning, and I'm one of those people, you'll see beautiful things online where you can make lovely maps and charts of your garden. Mine is more the hand-drawn lines and squiggles. So, you know, whatever works for you, always date it and keep 3 or 4 years of plans, because then you can follow a good crop rotation. So for instance, I knew things last year's garden were given, where my asparagus and garlic had overwintered. So then I built my garden plan based on that, using my handy dandy plant companion chart. So I each year love that process of sitting down, visualizing the garden as I draw out which gets to be in which spot, and keeping in mind who's a friend and who's a foe, and who was there last year or the year before. Because again, crops like tomatoes and potatoes, you do want to move them along into new spots. So, a little bit else about these plants. As I mentioned, these have been outside already. What a bonus. But they're going to go back in, given the weather forecast, and be put into good light. Before they go into the garden, they're going to need what's called hardening off. You're going to have to gently introduce them to outdoors and real light. They're going to have to learn to stand up to breezes, like today's. And so you'll find a good spot. This porch for me happens to be wonderful. Could be under a tree, sheltered wall somewhere, where you gradually expose your plants an hour a day, building up to planting season, before you get them into the garden where they can stand this, you know, the full light and the wind. So that's our seed starting in a nutshell. We're going to go back to our PowerPoint now.
It's an awesome video, Glenda. Thanks.
So, yeah, and I realized I didn't actually talk about transplanting, so that was my mistake. So just on the blank screen here, just a little bit about transplanting. The key of hardening off, really essential. Take a minimum of 6 days to do the hardening off, 6 to 7 days to really, you'll shock your plants if you put them straight outdoors, and you'll be sad to see all the leaves drop and lose the plant. Transplanting, I feel like it's one of those things kind of hard to describe. I'd rather have shown it, but none of my plants are ready for that stage. But just a little bit of damp. If your container is damp, it'll come out. The plant will come out quite well with its roots intact and the soil around them. Gently ease it into the next size pot up. Don't move pot sizes extremely large, like move it, another couple inch size pot. The general rule of thumb is, as tall as the plant is, the depth of the container should be roughly the same. So keep that in mind. And just a little hint, if you're replanting your tomato plants, if you sink them deep, most plants you just want to plant them just at root level where the soil where they've started and keep that soil level consistent. But you actually get better root development on your tomato plants as you dig them deeper into the soil. So you basically move them up almost to that where the first leaf comes out. If you sink that stalk into the soil that far, new roots will develop and your tomato plant will have good, strong base to hold up to, again, the inevitable winds and things like that that we get. So back to this planning concept. As I say, my hand-drawn records over the years I keep. Why to practice rotation? Well, one thing for sure is different plants each have different nutrient needs, and that's what they're going to be pulling from the soil. So by rotating the plants around, you're creating the opportunity for the soil, to provide in a different space what that plant needs for the soil to recover. And certain plants can help set other plants up well. So I always where I plant my peas this year, that will be where I'm planting my garlic in the fall. And I love it because the peas help fix nitrogen. The peas will be done by generally by August. So it's a perfect time. It's ready. That space is there for me to plant my garlic. If I've had my beans in the garden in one spot, usually the next year I'll have the squash plants there because again, the beans have fixed nitrogen and I know my squash plants are going to need that. So there's lots of good resources online about how to plan those out, your garden. But again, I really encourage you to keep the records so that you can go back to oh, I've grown my tomatoes here 3 years in a row. Wonder why they're not doing so well. Why is my harvest? Oh, someone had that about their harvest not succeeding as much as they thought, and maybe it's been because the soil's tired. It's given what it can for that plant, and it's time to move to a different space. I like if you're doing rows to think of rows being north-south, and that's partly when you think of when the sun comes up in the east, it's tracking around to the south, to the west. North-south rows help make sure that the sunlight is even for your garden. But do think where you're putting your tall plants. For me, my tallest will be things like my pole beans. So they tend to be at the north side of my garden because they're going to be casting a shadow for sure. And then there's the sprawling plants, the cucumbers, pumpkins, squash. I also might put those near, especially my cucumbers might go near where my garlic is because my garlic will be pulled late July. And by then that's when the cucumbers are in full growth. So they'll be taking over that space, or perhaps near a path. So it can just jumble out onto the path. Or if you're lucky, up the fence and grow it up the fence. I still get deer will sometimes eat my squash plants once they've been growing. They're not supposed to eat squash, but they do sometimes. So you never know. And you can also use things like tall plants to your advantage because sometimes you may want a wee bit of shade for certain things. And for example, I have asparagus. It's set in my garden. It will cast a shadow for sure when the afternoon sun comes around. So the east side of the asparagus is quite cool. So guess what? That's where I'm going to put some of the plants that like it cooler, that don't like the intense heat. So plants that tend to be on the cool side of life are things like spinach, broccoli, kale, peas, radish, lettuce. Those are also the crops that you can tend to get into the garden earlier. I have to confess, just like everyone last week, I got really excited. I put like a 2-meter row of spinach in, 40 cents worth of seeds. It may work, it may not. But the other plants like in that list, the broccoli, kale and stuff, they'll probably May 1st will be about when I aim to get those in the garden, depending on how the weather rolls, if the garden's dry enough for me. I'll head start some of my lettuce, so it'll go in as already stunned, but I'll also direct seed. Then there's the heat lovers, the tomatoes, squash, cucumber, beans, corn, peppers, eggplant was mentioned, okra would all be in that kind of they like it hot. My tomatoes will probably start going out into the big containers or into garden space in the community gardens in town somewhere about the May 24 weekend. But definitely squash, cucumbers, most of my beans, especially not pole beans, won't be going in until probably June 1st in our area. Again, Cornwall, you're in a whole different group, so you can go earlier probably. Corn would be in that it also likes the heat. So in our area, you almost have to pre-start corn to get a good length of time to get it the corn ripened. Peppers love hot, so don't jump the season by putting them in too early. They'll just sulk and suffer from it, and you set them back, and it takes them a while to recover. So soon you're ready to grow. And that's fantastic. And I love that so many people are interested in learning about gardening. It's just, it gives us so much faith. And it's to say, it's so much fun and such a good thing to teach children. Um, Keys, give space for your plants to grow. It's so easy to jam them in here because they're tiny little things in the spring. And then all of a sudden your tomatoes are like side by each competing and the breeze can't get through to offer circulation. I'm guilty of this with my beans most year because I plant them quite thick and then I don't want to go through and thin them, or my beets. And then sometimes you can end up with issues of mold, or you end up with just reduced harvest because of too much competition in the space. Do plant some flowers and herbs. The flowers, especially the herbs, go to flower as well. You're attracting different pollinators to your garden. And again, if you look at some of the charts, there's some lovely relationships, of course, of which flowers and herbs help reduce insects. So of course, the classic would be some of the marigolds, but dill and stuff. There's lots of benefits from some. So take a look at that and think what you can incorporate into your garden. We've talked about mulch, and I heard the idea of gravel or stone mulch to help discourage squirrels. Mulching well helps conserve soil moisture, helps reduce weeds, and depending on what mulch you choose, you actually will improve your soil. I'm a huge fan of collecting all the bags of leaves in the fall that I can from town where people have nicely raked them for me, take them home, stash them underneath my porch, and then use them between my rows. I really aim for things like maple and birch leaves. So I'll actually kind of scope someone's yard first. And because oak leaves just mat too much and my soil probably is acidic enough. But the nice thing about when you're walking on those leaves between the rows, your feet will naturally break them down and mulch them. Then the earthworms will do the rest of the work for you and carry the nutrients down to the root levels where the plants need it and help improve your soil. Remove diseased foliage. I know it's heartbreaking sometimes to have to rip out a plant, but if you leave a plant that has powdery mildew or something like that, it's going to spread to the others. So removing the leaves or sometimes removing the entire plant. And I am very diligent about that. I will take, 100 meters away from the garden, and I generally don't put the diseased foliage into my composter. I didn't really put this on there, but please compost. Compost is a wonderful thing to add to your garden. So if you have space for a composter, do consider it. And watering wisely. Most people know the rule, the idea that watering in the morning is best. Not leaving your plants dripping wet in the evening can help reduce the issues of mold and things like that. I'm really a fan of drip irrigation hoses, soaker hoses, things like that, and just a good old watering can. If you can avoid watering with we're in Georgian Bay, we have super cold but chlorinated water because I'm on town water. So that's a bit of a shock to the plants, if you can imagine, especially if you're trying to get these guys, these warm lovers, the peppers and tomatoes to grow, and then you're giving them like icy cold water at their roots. So filling up a barrel, having a rain barrel is all preferred methods for watering your plants. And as Delana mentioned, all the information you need and more, way more than we could cover today, is on the Biosphere website. So great information, some videos featuring Delana as well, and to help answer any questions. And of course, inevitably, I've forgotten to say something and something we've missed. So I wishing everyone a super duper growing season, and there's nothing wrong with sending Delana pictures of your successes through the summer into the fall. So I'm going back to our main, if we can, perhaps, and open up for questions.
We've had so many questions come in, Glenda. I'm going to just really quickly share my screen. There's a lot of questions about when to start seeds. This is a page from the Seed to Soil Guide. I've called it the Eastern Georgian Bay Planting Chart. It has a list of, as you can see, all the variety of different crops, when you would start them indoors relative to when you take them out. So 5 to 6 weeks for beets if you wanted to start them indoors, for instance. And then the earliest outside transplant or sow date. So for instance, what's a good one? Where's eggplant I was looking at. it says the 3rd of June, because you absolutely need to make sure that there's not going to be frost. So I find this chart, I still reference it myself. Nobody memorizes these things, right? So we're going to send the link, and I might just attach this as a PDF to that follow-up email, and I think it will really help. There's a bunch of other things I just wanted to show about companion planting and crop rotation. This is the guide. I'm just going to go up to the table of contents really quickly. So a lot of the key points that we've touched on today that Glenda's noted, they're also in here as well. So you can go back and reference this. I really suggest even printing it out and having a copy. One of the other questions that we have been getting a lot, Glenda, is how long do you use seed for once you have it in a package? You use it 1 year. Maybe you don't use it all. Do you use it again the next year? It's funny because we were just
Oh yeah, I am a no. I will use. I planted some beefsteak tomatoes, and I looked at the package. It said 2015, and and I can proudly say that the germination rate was about 90%. So a little bit depends on the seed. There's no harm in trying. I also shared with Delana just before this, I had some old parsley seeds. So I thought, what the heck, I'm going to try it. And it's zero. And like, so, you know, seeds are like lovely little powerhouses, good, lots of energy in them. But again, it depends also how they get stored. Mine get stored in just in the paper package, but in a cool room all winter and such. And also keep them cooled and dark might help your seed longevity as well. But I always figure there's no harm in trying. Try a couple. I mean, obviously don't bet all your whole garden on 8 to 10-year-old seeds, but no harm in trying.
Yeah. Jose has a fun question. I like this. At what point do you give up on your seeds and purchase already started plants?
When you're looking at them and your broccoli is this one little spindly stalk and you're going, yeah, but you're not going to stand up for the first one raindrop that hits you. And then you're like, because perhaps the hardest problem for most people starting seeds at home is not having adequate light. I mean, truly, they do need, and when you think windows will filter sunlight, you're not getting the full UV. Grow lights, yep, they're expensive, but again, treat your plant. You might have a spot in your house. Maybe you have great windows. Maybe you have a porch that has maybe single pane glass that when it's warm during the day, you can transfer that. Heck, I've even used my car for, back of the car with the hatch up as a way for my plants to get a wee bit of sun and stuff. But if your seedlings, what you've started, doesn't look healthy, head off to your local nursery and purchase what you need. I mean, it happens. It happens. And that's why I said one of the advantages of buying started plants is you can judge the health right away. You're looking for good, strong stalks. You're looking for good green leaves, not curling and things like that. Don't necessarily, this whole thing about buying tomato plants that are all like 3 feet high and stuff and already with fruit on them. Sure. But, the others will catch up too by buying the smaller plants.
Yeah, I found just anecdotally that sometimes the larger plants have a tougher time adjusting. Like their roots are already quite large, and it's not really a net gain, especially because you pay more for them.
Yeah. And, things like the squash and stuff. I think I mentioned it in the video and then forgot to talk about it. The squash and cucumbers really don't like to be transplanted either. So sometimes you're better off doing them directly in the garden. I make do with some peat pots, and then I make sure I kind of tear out part of the bottom of the pot and make some slits in it so they have an easy way of getting, but I'm not really actually taking them out of the pot when I plant them.
So we have at least 10 more questions, but I am at the time. So I just want to say to anyone who has to leave now, of course, please do what you need to do. We are going to do our best, though. Glenda and I will stay on to answer these questions because they are important and we really want to be helpful. But if you need to leave, we totally understand, and thanks for joining us. The next question from Joanne. Hi, Joanne. Joanne's wondering when to use blood meal and bone meal.
Okay. So blood meal will help add some nitrogen to your soil. So nitrogen loving plants, again, that would be things like the heavier feeders, squash, cucumbers, corn, things like that. Back to the person at the squirrel question. Sometimes blood meal can help discourage squirrels, and sometimes I swear it invites them in. Bone meal is for the plants that need sort of root development often. And so I tend to use the bone meal if I'm putting it in the garden will be either early spring, like now, and let it just on the surface and then work it in slowly and gradually, and then or in the fall. But blood meal mixed in a wee bit in the soil when you're planting is a fine way to do it. It's a little nitrogen boost.
Yeah. Fern has asked if there's somewhere that we can send soil samples from the garden for analysis of what's there. I'm not
Can
aware
I?
of
Sorry,
anywhere.
go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not aware of anywhere you can send them, but I do have some suggestions. But
I should have looked before now. It used to be University of Guelph through the Ministry of Ag, and it used to be free, but I doubt it is anymore. Just saying. You can get simple pH tests off of like I think even as Canadian Tire, things like that. Lee Valley would be a way you can get pH for testing your soil. But there's also like, honestly, if you've grown your soil for a bit, your plants will tell you what it's missing. You'll just see, like if you look at your tomato plants and the leaves are curling and purple, because I grew up on a farm, my dad had this innate, first thing I saw my garden, he's like, oh, you guys, you don't have enough calcium in your soil. Like, yeah. So your plants will tell you what's missing. But and again, there's some good resources online. If you plug in, my tomato plants have purplish leaves that are curling. Oh, okay. This is you have a potassium or calcium deficiency.
yeah, the little kits you can buy even just from Home Hardware, they're relatively inexpensive and they're kind of fun. If you're interested too in knowing how much clay versus loam you have in your garden, in the Seed to Soil Guide, there's more instructions. But basically, if you take a handful of your garden soil in a mason jar with water, shake, leave it overnight, as you can all imagine, those particles are going to separate in the water and you get kind of the banding. So you can see maybe there's a ton of clay that's floating on top or a ton of the heavier solids at the bottom. It's kind of a fun thing to do, especially if you have kids too, and they'll give you a rough idea. Monica's asked if you've ever used hydrogen peroxide, very diluted, to water seedlings. She says it's working well for her.
I've heard that, and I have not. I'm assuming that's to avoid fungal issues on the soil, and I have used, and even this spring, because back to the caring of seedlings, my plants must have got a little damp, so I could see that faint little line of mold. I just go to the cinnamon shaker and sprinkle cinnamon on the surface, and cinnamon also has that antifungal, so that's what I've done. The other option is once your plants are up, put a fan near your seedlings and put it on low, because again, just getting that airflow that you're not creating issues with fungal growth. But I have not tried the peroxide. I might even look that up. I've had some fun because I remember hearing someone not so long ago giving advice too about using Epsom salts while planting tomatoes and stuff. And again, you hear a lot of these things and keep thinking, oh, well, there might be something there. And then you look up and go, all the university researched papers I could find showed no good outcomes for using things like Epsom salts. So like, again, if someone tells you and swears by something, try to do a little bit of research and see if there's some science to back up. Because Lord knows we're going with a lack of science with some things right now, and it not helping us.
So there's a comment here that someone's radishes have really excellent greenery, but no radish. Do you know why that might be?
I wonder if it's, again, radishes don't go well in my sand, so I don't even really bother with them anymore. I wonder if your soil is just a little too high in nitrogen and it's gone to leaf rather than root development. Mm-hmm. So root development, phosphorus is what you need. So let's just say that's a more speculative guess than actually informed, speaking of lack of science to back up but that'd be my best bet. You too much nitrogen or too closely planted together, just thinking. So it's just doing the leaf and it doesn't have chance for root development, and or you got heavy duty super duper McKellar clay soil and the poor little root can't even go through it.
So a really good question from Tammy. What can we do to prevent powdery mildew?
Oh, yes, that's where that dilute hydrogen peroxide might come in. I've also heard dilute spraying with baking soda, like putting a bit of like a teaspoon. Don't quote me on the ratio, but that would be, again, something to look up online. And again, realize that I'm not saying this with the university papers behind it to say it works, but I've heard of baking soda and water sprayed on the leaves to help reduce powdery mildew. But back to the basics is, well, okay, and this I didn't say. Also, you might consider what's underneath the plant. I didn't say I have to use landscape cloth with my squash and cucumbers to help prevent the contact of soil, which can be some of the powdery mildew issue. But the other could be that you've planted things too close and there's not enough air circulation. So try to give the space, but may look into that baking soda thing because, again, it has been a problem in my garden. So I guess I need to try it to know for sure. And I haven't done that yet.
Okay, and a question from Jennifer. You mentioned the cool plants can be started
Mhm.
earlier than the hot plants, and you mentioned starting lettuce, but do you
Mhm.
put the seed in the ground or do you start all of that seed in your house?
I do half and half. So I will pre-start some of my lettuces, and that way it guarantees that when I plant them, when they go into the ground, they get better spaced apart. Because when I drop lettuce seeds in the ground, they come up very often a little too thick, and then I have to go through the thinning thing, which, to be honest, is my least favorite garden chore, is thinning. So I go half and half. And I want to be clear. I mean, the heat-loving plants, I still start at this time, like the tomatoes and peppers and all those get started now. It just, they don't go into the garden. So it's back to that chart that Delana showed. The seed starting can happen, but it's not in the garden until like June for eggplant and stuff. But yeah, for things like, there are many things I like to start ahead, just to, like kale, I'll start a bit and ahead, but then plant some direct seed. I'm not a fan of like I won't start radishes in a container. I won't start carrots. I am not going to transplant parsnips from a container. I'll do it for leeks and onions, but that's about it. You can use semi-skim milk for mildew. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff like that. So that's a fun thing to wear. And again, experiment. What works for you?
Yeah.
Looks expensive. Darn, I'd rather use baking soda.
So Margaret has a backyard that does not have much sun, and she's wondering if those cool plants that you listed, because they're cool, do they not need much sun? Like, are they a good bet for back there?
They still need sun. So again, it's those plants will suffer in July. Like spinach does not like our July weather. Too long light, too long light then, like 14-hour days. You still want a space that gets, 6 to 8 for those. So try to find those corners if you have. Try to look then at putting containers that at least you can maybe move to the sun as you can. But yeah, you want sun.
Yeah. The shadiest vegetable that I know of is bok choy. I think
Hmm.
it can handle more shade than almost anything else. You did mention some organic fertilizers before, but Tammy's asked if you could recommend some organic fertilizers to use.
Yeah, and that's where again, I buy kelp powder in a large quantity and just mix it in as I'm watering in my watering can. That tends to be my go-to other than just compost. Um, with wood ash from my fireplace mixed into the compost through the season. I know other friends that fish emulsion, love fish emulsion, as I say, and the bone meal, blood meals, things like that. And it can pick up some of the commercially made, naturally based fertilizers and read through and see if you're comfortable with that list of ingredients. And we didn't really talk again. Sorry, there's so many things. For us on acid and more acidic soils, you may want to consider things like bringing in powdered limestone to help move your acidity. And that's something I definitely do about once every 10 years as a layer of powdered limestone, dolomitic limestone. If a Cornwall person's still on, no, not your problem for sure. But yeah, for us up here on the shield, that doesn't hurt to sort of more to help neutralize your soils.
Brenda has some questions about the container gardening. So, two questions. Do cherry tomato seedlings need thinning before going into the container? And how tall does the basil seedlings need to be before transplant?
Okay, excellent question. Yeah, so generally, I mean, I like too many cherry tomatoes in one container is going to be a lot of competition. So it's hard to answer that without knowing the size of the container. Like a super large container could maybe handle 2 or 3 cherry tomato plants, especially if they're the tiny Tim variety, some of the, like the dwarf types. My cherry tomatoes are like the grape tomatoes and stuff, so they grow quite tall. They still need baskets, so I only have 1 plant in each container. So it really depends on space. I would think the general, like other than the dwarfs, the general rule of thumb is 1 tomato plant. I would like to have about a foot of space at least around it. So I wouldn't have its neighbor too sad. Basil, as soon as it's up to 3 to 4 inches high, it's ready to go out or into another container. Transplant carefully, and yeah, then you're good.
Brenda's just commented that her containers are about 24 inches across. So in
Okay.
any case, you could, and what can be fun is to do 2 different things, like a tomato and an eggplant or a pepper or something, or just for some
Yeah.
variety or lots of basil.
Yeah. And tomato and lettuce, like, put some lettuce at the base, and that's lovely.
Yeah. Okay, so we are whittling down our questions a little bit. Jennifer's in Sudbury, and she's
Oh,
asking if they're a week or 2 behind us, timing wise.
yes.
Yeah, they are, and I have a link to an interactive map of all the hardiness zones. So the chart that I showed you, Jennifer, might not be quite as applicable, but I can show you. I'll be sending everyone this link to the hardiness zones, and that information in that chart was from the Farmer's Almanac, and you can also look up that same information relevant to your zone in the almanac. But would you say, Glenda, that 2 weeks is like a good?
Yeah, and because we have a moderating influence of Georgian Bay, and Sudbury you don't, and that makes a huge difference. And you guys will get frost later than we. I believe in that chart though too. It always, what the caveat is, we put in dates to say like for our area, but it's like 4 weeks before your last frost date. So just looking up what Sudbury's last frost date is, which I suspect is probably about May 31 or so, then base everything on that. So if I were you, tomato plants could still be started because you're kind of a week behind us and things like that. So yeah.
So there's a question that I've saved for a little while, and I apologize I didn't get to it sooner, but there's a lot to be said. The question is, do you have any tips on how to compost without attracting bears?
Oh yeah.
Glenda and
I could do a whole session on this.
This is
And
why
I think I have.
And like, I am probably as passionate about composting as I am about gardening. And I will just say that there is a section of composting in the seed to soil guide that we're sending out. But Glenda, if you want to have any quick tips on discouraging bears.
Quick tips. Yep. In a nutshell, my place backs onto the forest. Yes, there's lots of bears. See them occasionally when I'm walking the dog and things. My composter is cheaply made out of recycled pallets that are put together over metal fence posts and then with hardware cloth nailed to it all around the bin. Locks on the lift up lids, 3 pallets wide, so it's big. And back to I collect leaves from town through the fall, and I have those bags. So when I put compost into my composter, I cover it either with leaves or wood chips, shredded paper, you name it. So the nitrogen carbon ratio is key. I've been doing compost at our place for 21 years now. Only once did we have a bear lift the lid of the one when we used to have a black plastic composter, lifted the lid and actually didn't disturb anything. So chop up what you're putting in small, cover it with leaves or other, carbon type material. Don't put in breads, meats, and the cheeses and all those things that you kind of do. And don't overload it with fruit. So for instance, you've just maybe made apple sauce and you have like a half bushel of apple cores. Don't throw them all in at once, I'm afraid. You can always freeze some stuff and throw it in over stages. But again, it's certainly possible. Our place is a good testament to that. We'll get about 4 to 5 wheelbarrow loads of compost a year out of our composter.
So this is the last question for right now. And again, I saved it for a little while. I apologize, but someone is moving from Niagara to Parry Sound and curious if we've had any success growing fruit trees, and if so, which ones?
How much do you like the bears coming back here? Niagara, oh my gosh, you're changing zones. Yeah, I grew up where we also had peach trees and just my neighbors grow apples. Again, it's possible. apples would be the one that jumps out to me, crab apples. There are probably people that can speak way better to this than I, because I haven't grown a lot of fruit trees, just because I do know uh, it's hard to discourage a bear from wanting to eat the apples from a tree. And in town here in the fall, where we have problems with bears in town, tend to be based on where the apple trees are. And I can just laugh because I know Delaney used to live near one. And yeah, so that will be, I guess, for you to learn when you get here. And but yeah, apples can be grown for sure. You'll have to just import the peaches from Niagara.
And it's a little site specific. I have a friend who lives in Sudbury and she actually has a peach tree in her yard. So it just, yeah, I know. I was shocked. I said you could sell those peach pits.
Yeah.
But so it's a little site. I'm not even going to try.
Particular to the site.
Thank you. And there is a company, I've known a few people to purchase fruit trees from the Hardy Fruit Tree Company, and I believe they might be based out of Ottawa or Gatineau, something like that. But anyway, I think if you're going to be purchasing any, that would be at least a top of mind recommendation right now.
And I do know a person here who's doing fig trees, but she's moving them into her garage in winter, so it's a bit of a production. So but pick what you want, pick your passion and go with it, right? If it's something you love, then yeah, I want to hear who can get a peach tree going in Parry Sound.
Yeah. All right. That's all the questions that we had. So that's terrific. So like I mentioned, we're going to be sending a couple of things in the follow-up email, as well as the link once this recording has been posted to YouTube. Glenda and I are also available for photos and questions. Like we can talk about this stuff all day endlessly. And I just remember too, that quote in the beginning, it's so much information. It can definitely feel overwhelming, but you just have to start somewhere and be patient and do what you can. And like we all make mistakes and it happens every year. It's just, that's kind of the fun of it though, is the trial and error, I think. So yeah, don't be shy to be in touch or anything like that. Glenda, was there anything you wanted to say too?
No, it's perfect. It starts with a seed and they're all in your hands now.
Yeah. All righty. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and appreciate that you were able to stay on the line with us for a little bit after 11 o'clock. And we hope you have happy gardening this year, and yeah, all the best. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you for hosting.